Hi Year 12, this is section 4 for our Mrs. Dalloway. This is a longer section, so it's likely going to take 2 videos because I can only do a recording of 1 hour at a time. This is quite a bit longer than the last one. If you do hear speaking in the background, apologies, my husband is gaming in the room and so I've told him to try and keep quiet, but we'll see. Alright, so we are going with Peter's point of view is continuing on from section 3, and if you want to write down the annotation before we begin for the anaphora of still, and I've got this in the colour that I use for the time motif, and this use of still here emphasises the ongoing passage of time. Alright. It was awful, he cried. Awful, awful. Still, the sun was hot. Still, one got over things. Still, life had a way of adding day to day. Still, he thought, yawning and beginning to take notice, Regent's Park had changed very little since he was a boy, except for the squirrels. Still, presumably there were compensations. When little Elise Mitchell, who had been picking up pebbles to add to the pebble collection which she and her brother were making on the nursery mantelpiece, plumped her handful down on the nurse's knee and scudded off again full tilt into a lady's legs, Peter Walsh laughed out. Now, we are about to change now into Lucrezia's point of view. So we've got Septimus's wife, Ritza. So remember, this is Septimus who has PTSD, and his wife is quite tormented by the loss of her husband to this mental illness. Now, here you might want to write down, we've got parallels between Peter and Ritza. They are both rejected by the one they love. Peter's self-pity at being rejected seems self-indulgent compared to the Smiths' situation. So, given the torment that Septimus and his wife are going through, Peter's worries seem quite insignificant in comparison. And we might actually also write down this annotation. Ritza's rhetorical questions demonstrate her anguish and also reflect the existential suffering of modern man. Now, this is a modernist concern, so this idea of existential suffering is, very, very much something that the modernists were concerned with. But Lucrezia Warren Smith was saying to herself, "It's wicked. Why should I suffer?" she was asking as she walked down the broad path. "No, I can't stand it any longer," she was saying, having left Septimus, who wasn't Septimus any longer, to say hard, cruel, wicked things, to talk to himself, to talk to a dead man on the seat over there, when the child ran full tilt into her, fell flat and burst out crying. That was comforting, rather. She stood her upright, dusted her frock, kissed her. But for herself, she had done nothing wrong. She had loved Septimus. She had been happy. She had had a beautiful home, and there her sister lived still making hats. Why should she suffer? The child ran straight back to its nurse, and Ritza saw her scolded, comforted, taken up by the nurse, who put down her knitting, and the kind-looking man gave her his watch to blow open to comfort her. But why should she be exposed? Why not left in Milan? Why tortured? Why? Slightly waved by tears, the broad path, the nurse, the man in grey, the perambulator rose and fell before her eyes. To be rocked by this malignant torturer was her lot. But why? She was like a bird sheltering under the thin hollow of a leaf, who blinks as the sun, when the leaf moves, starts at the crack of a dry twig. She was exposed. She was surrounded by the enormous trees, vast clouds of an indifferent world, exposed, tortured. And why should she suffer? Why? She frowned. She stamped her foot. She must go back again to Septimus, since it was almost time for them to be going to Sir William Bradshaw. She must go back and tell him. Go back to him sitting there on the green chair under the tree, talking to himself or to that dead man Evans, whom she had only seen once for a moment in the shop. He had seemed a nice, quiet man, a great friend of Septimus's, and he had been killed in the war. But such things happen to everyone. Everyone has friends who were killed in the war. Everyone gives up something when they marry. She had given up her home. She had come to live here in this awful city. But Septimus let himself think about horrible things, as she could too if she tried. He had grown stranger and stranger. He said people were talking behind the bedroom walls. Mrs. Filmer thought it odd. He saw things too. He had seen an old woman's head in the middle of a fern. Yet he could be happy when he chose. They went to Hampton Court on top of a bus, and they were perfectly happy. All the little red and yellow flowers were out on the grass like floating lamps, he said, and talked and chatted and laughed, making up stories. Suddenly he said, "Now we will kill ourselves," when they were standing by the river, and he looked at it with a look which she had seen in his eyes when a train went by or an omnibus, a look as if something fascinated him. She felt he was going from her, and she caught him by the arm. But going home he was perfectly quiet, perfectly reasonable. He would argue with her about killing themselves and explain how wicked people were, how he could see them making up lies as they passed in the street. He knew all their thoughts, he said. He knew everything. He knew the meaning of the world, he said. And when they got back, he could hardly walk. He lay on the sofa and made her hold his hand to prevent him from falling. Down, down, he cried, into the flames, and saw faces laughing at him, calling him horrible, disgusting names from the walls, and hands pointing round the screen. Yet they were quite alone. But he began to talk aloud, answering people, arguing, laughing, crying, getting very excited, making her write things down. Perfect nonsense it was. About death, about Miss Isabel Pole. She could stand it no longer. She would go back. Isabel Pole, you don't need to write this down, learn a little bit more about her later, but she was a poet and a Shakespeare teacher, and Septimus had been in love with her before he went to war. She was close to him now, could see him staring at the sky, muttering, clasping his hands. Yet Dr. Holmes said there was nothing the matter with him. What then had happened? Why had he gone? Then why, when she sat by him, did he start, frown at her, move away, and point at her hand, take her hand, look at it, terrified? Was it that she had taken off her wedding ring? My hand has grown so thin, she said. I've put it in my purse, she told him. Now we go to Septimus's point of view. He dropped her hand. Their marriage was over, he thought, with agony, with relief. The rope was cut. He mounted. He was free, as it was decreed that he, Septimus, the lord of men, should be free, alone, since his wife had thrown away her wedding ring, since she had left him. He, Septimus, was alone, called forth in advance of the mass of men to hear the truth, to learn the meaning which now at last, after all the toils of civilization, Greeks, Romans, Shakespeare, Darwin, and now himself, was to be given whole to whom? He asked aloud. To the Prime Minister. The voices which rustled above his head replied. The supreme secret must be told to the Cabinet first. That trees are alive. Next, there is no crime. Next, love, universal love. He muttered, gasping, trembling, painfully drawing out these profound truths which needed, so deep were they, so difficult, an immense effort to speak out. But the world was entirely changed by them forever. Now, what we've got here is this existential questioning and this nature that it's ongoing and timeless. So in his insanity here, and this is where we've got Septimus, who is hallucinating and having visions and hearing things, that when he believes that he's hearing the truth, he talks about it's what the Greeks and the Romans and Shakespeare and Darwin and have all kind of, thought about and agonized over in the past. And so here Woolf is saying, well, this existential questioning, which can seem quite mad, has been going on since time began and will continue to go on. You know, I guess really suggesting that there is no answer. No crime, love, he repeated, fumbling for his card and pencil, when a Skye Terrier snuffed his trousers and he started in an agony of fear. It was turning into a man. He could not watch it happen. It was horrible, terrible to see a dog become a man. At once the dog trotted away. Heaven was divinely merciful, infinitely benignant. It spared him, pardoned his weakness. But what was the scientific explanation? For one must be scientific above all things. Why could he see through bodies, see into the future, when dogs will become men? It was a heat wave, presumably, operating upon a brain made sensitive by eons of evolution. Scientifically speaking, the flesh was melted off the world. His body was macerated until only the nerve fibres were left. It was spread like a veil upon a rock. He lay back in his chair, exhausted but upheld. He lay resting, waiting, before he again interpreted, with effort, with agony, to mankind. He lay very high on the back of the world. The earth thrilled beneath him. Red flowers grew through his flesh. Their stiff leaves rustled by his head. Music began clanging against the rocks up here. Just a motor horn down in the street, he muttered. But up here it cannoned from rock to rock, divided, met in shocks of sound which rose in smooth columns. That music should be visible was a discovery, and became an anthem twined and twined round now by a shepherd boy's piping. That's an old man playing a penny whistle by the public house, he muttered, which as the boy stood still came bubbling from his pipe, and then, as he climbed higher, made its exquisite plaint, while the traffic passed beneath. This boy's elegy is played among the traffic, thought Septimus. Now he withdraws up into the snows, and roses hang about him. The thick red roses which grow on my bedroom wall, he reminded himself. The music stopped. He has his penny, he reasoned it out, and has gone on to the next public house. Now, all of this, we've got this, this disillusionment happening for Septimus, and he's hearing these sounds that are happening around him, and he's imagining them as being something that he can see and bouncing around, and it becomes part of his hallucination. What we need to look at though now, and this is a bit of extra writing, but we have got, I might make this a bit smaller, hold on. All right. In the novel, Clarissa and Septimus act as doubles. Now, this is an important aspect of Mrs. Dalloway. So, whilst the two characters never actually meet, they're doubles of each other. In a sense, Clarissa is, I guess, the sane character, and Septimus the insane one. Sorry. And you'll see what I've got written here. Doubling reveals the instability of identity, the inescapability of memory, and the coexistence of multiple selves within a single consciousness. Now, with Clarissa and Septimus, we have psychological mirroring. Now, Septimus acts as Clarissa's psychic double, embodying the existential despair and alienation that she suppresses. So whilst she thinks about these things, and the despair, she doesn't reveal them to anyone, and she's able to put on this facade of being quite happy and satisfied, and you know, she does indeed find a lot of happiness in moments and beauty in ordinary things, as does Septimus. But it allows for us to see Septimus, who doesn't have that desire or that need anymore to put on a face for the world. He just embodies this existential despair and alienation, and he's out there, you know, talking to himself and seeing his dead friend and talking about these things quite freely. He no longer has any desire to hide this within, you know, that he's feeling. Now, both of the characters feel the weight of mortality. So Clarissa fears it. Septimus sees death as his escape. Both are preoccupied with existence. Now, Clarissa and Septimus embody different responses to existential crisis. One internalized, the other externalized, which is what I was just kind of saying. And then here you can see Clarissa represses the darker aspects of herself. Her fears about death, isolation, and the futility of her social role. Septimus externalizes them. And just continued over this side. A key concern in modernist literature is the instability of the self-identity, often presented as fluid, relational, and contingent upon external forces. And with this mirroring, we've got what we call the doppelganger motif. Now, this is a Gothic literature element. Think of things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the doppelganger motif was used to represent an individual's shadow self that represents their suppressed desires or fears. So, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you have the doctor who's very sensible and embodies humanity and is well regarded, but then he's got this dark desire that he represses inside of himself, and through the creation of this other part of himself, he's able to express those desires and fears, and that's through that doppelganger. Okay, so if you think about that, I mean, obviously this isn't a complete true doppelganger situation with Clarissa and Septimus. It is rather utilizing that notion that there's that double side of an individual, and ordinarily the darker, less accepted side is repressed, but Septimus, in the insanity that has occurred due to PTSD, is able to externalize that. Alright, so I know you probably had to pause and whatnot to get that written down. Where were we? Over here. So what we needed to have annotated in, so the mirroring and the doubling of Clarissa and Septimus is relevant here. So where we've got red flowers grew through his flesh, roses hung about him, the thick red roses which grow on my bedroom wall, they're obviously part of his hallucination, but we've got the flower motif used to connect with Clarissa. So whilst her flowers are real, Septimus's are hallucinated. Now, the other thing that I want you to make note of is, as he's describing this music that he's hearing and the whistle, the penny whistle that he hears, he uses these words, exquisite plaint and elegy. Now, if you have a look down here, so we know, like, exquisite is something that is beautiful. Now, plaint is a sad lamentation. So a lamentation is something that is recognizing of someone who has died or the dead, and it expresses grief. So it's a beautiful, sad lamentation. And an elegy is a song that laments the dead. So Septimus sees the beauty in death, because he describes this as a really beautiful sound. Okay. But he himself remained high on his rock, like a drowned sailor on a rock. I leant over the edge of the boat and fell down, he thought. I went under the sea. I have been dead and yet am now alive. But let me rest still, he begged. He was talking to himself again. It was awful, awful. And as, before waking, the voices of birds and the sound of wheels chime and chatter in a queer harmony, grow louder and louder, and the sleeper feels himself drawing to the shores of life, so that he felt himself drawing towards life, the sun growing hotter, cries sounding louder, something tremendous about to happen. Now I've just pointed out here we've got this interjection. I think it's Ritza's point of view, that because she's kind of walking towards him and, you know, she's really upset that he's talking to himself in public. But I read something today that it could also be Woolf's, like Virginia Woolf's interjection. And that expression of her own understanding of what it's like to be in a complete mental breakdown and how that feels. So, yeah. Okay. He had only to open his eyes, but a weight was on them, a fear. He strained, he pushed, he looked. He saw Regent's Park before him. Long streamers of sunlight fawned at his feet. The trees waved, brandished. We welcome, the world seemed to say. We accept, we create. Beauty, the world seemed to say. And as if to prove it scientifically, wherever he looked, at the houses, at the railings, at the antelopes stretching over the palings, beauty sprang instantly. To watch a leaf quivering in the rush of air was an exquisite joy. Up in the sky, swallows swooping, swerving, flinging themselves in and out, round and round, yet always with perfect control, as if elastics held them, and the flies rising and falling, the sun spotting now this leaf, now that, in mockery, dazzling it with soft gold in pure good temper. Now and again some chime, might be a motor horn, tinkling divinely on the grass stalks. All of this, calm and reasonable as it was, made out of ordinary things as it was the truth now. Beauty, that was the truth now. Beauty was everywhere. And this is the colour that I use for meaning, the search for meaning and fulfilment. We've got Septimus experiences to a heightened extent Clarissa's joy and wonder over the beauty in daily life. And then the time motif occurs here, and it's again that time interrupting, because in this moment where he is hallucinating, he's happy, he's seeing this beauty, and he's interrupted by Ritza. It is time, said Ritza. The word time split its husk, poured its riches over him, and from his lips fell like shells, like shavings from a plane, without his making them, hard, white, imperishable words, and flew to attach themselves to their places in an ode to time, an immortal ode to time. He sang. Evans answered from behind the tree. The dead were in Thessaly, Evans sang, among the orchards. There they waited till the war was over, and now the dead, now Evans himself. For God's sake, don't come, Septimus cried out, for he could not look upon the dead. But the branches parted. A man in grey was actually walking towards them. It was Evans. But no mud was on him, no wounds. He was not changed. I must tell the whole world, Septimus cried, raising his hand as the dead man in the grey suit came nearer, raising his hand like some colossal figure who has lamented the fate of man for ages in the desert alone, with his hands pressed to his forehead, furrows of despair on his cheeks, and now sees light on the desert's edge, which broadens and strikes the iron-black figure. And Septimus half rose from his chair, and with legions of men prostrate behind him, he, the giant mourner, receives for one moment on his face the whole... But I am so unhappy, Septimus, said Ritza, trying to make him sit down. I'll just go back here quickly. Now, this is still kind of the time motif. And I've got time has been contaminated by the horrors of war, and this is where we've got, time being described in images of war, fell like shells, like shavings from a plane. Now, just of note here, where he believes that he's seeing his dead friend Evans walking towards him, it's actually Peter Walsh who is coming towards the couple, and so that's who he is actually seeing. Believes it to be Evans. If you just want to write this down before I keep reading, so this next little bit, we've got the motif of time again. It passes, marches on, interrupts moments. The millions lamented, for ages they had sorrowed. He would turn round, he would tell them in a few moments, only a few moments more, of this relief, of this joy, of this astonishing revelation. The time, Septimus Reitzer repeated. What is the time? He was talking, he was starting. This man must notice him. He was looking at them. I will tell you the time, said Septimus, very slowly, very drowsily, smiling mysteriously at the dead man in the grey suit. As he sat smiling, the quarter struck, the 11:45. Now we shift to Peter's point of view, and here we see that Peter is oblivious to the extent of Septimus's suffering. So he completely mistakes the situation, and he thinks it's just a young couple who have gotten into a quarrel. And that is being young, Peter Walsh thought as he passed them. To be having an awful scene. The poor girl looked absolutely desperate in the middle of the morning. But what was it about, he wondered? What had the young man in the overcoat been saying to her to make her look like that? What awful fix had they got themselves into, both to look so desperate as that on a fine summer morning? The amusing thing about coming back to England after 5 years was the way it made, anyhow, the first days, things stand out as if one had never seen them before. Lovers squabbling under a tree, the domestic family life at the parks. Never had he seen London look so enchanting. The softness of the distances, the richness, the greenness, the civilization. After India, he thought, strolling across the grass. This susceptibility to impressions had been his undoing, no doubt. Still, at his age, he had, like a boy or a girl even, these alternations of mood. Good days, bad days, for no reason whatever. Happiness from a pretty face, downright misery at the sight of a frump. After India, of course, one fell in love with every woman one met. There was a freshness about them. Even the poorest dressed better than 5 years ago, surely, and to his eye, the fashions had never been so becoming. The long black cloaks, the slimness, the elegance, and then the delicious and apparently universal habit of paint. So here he's talking about makeup. So he's talking about how different everything seems and how different people are since he was last in London. And you might just want to write down the note here. As an outsider returning to London after 5 years, he is the only character who can appreciate the dramatic transformation to society after World War One. And so what he's seeing is the I guess the modernisation of fashion and makeup and the way people are presenting themselves. But it's all the stuff that is quite meaningless that he notices. It's the facades, I guess. Whereas Septimus has got that very opposite, deeper understanding of what's going on around him, or belief, I guess. Every woman, even the most respectable, had roses blooming under glass, lips cut with a knife, curls of Indian ink. There was design, art, everywhere. A change of some sort had undoubtedly taken place. What did the young people think about? Peter Walsh asked himself. Those 5 years, 1918 to 1923, had been, he suspected, somehow very important. People looked different. Newspapers seemed different. Now, for instance, there was a man writing quite openly in one of the respectable weeklies about water closets. Now, water closets were toilets, and so he thinks it's quite surprising that you could talk about something so private or write about something so private in a newspaper. That you couldn't have done 10 years ago, written quite openly about water closets in a respectable weekly. And then this taking out a stick of rouge or a powder puff and making up in public. On board ship coming home, there were lots of young men and girls. Betty and Bertie, he remembered in particular, carrying on quite openly. The old mother sitting and watching them with her knitting, cool as a cucumber. The girl would stand still and powder her nose in front of everyone. And they weren't engaged, just having a good time. No feelings hurt on either side. As hard as nails she was, Betty what's-her-name, but a thorough good sort. She would make a very good wife at 30. She would marry when it suited her to marry some rich man and live in a large house near Manchester. Who was it now who had done that? Peter Walsh asked himself, turning into the Broad Walk. Married a rich man and lived in a large house near Manchester. Somebody who had written him a long, gushing letter quite lately about blue hydrangeas? It was seeing blue hydrangeas that made her think of him in the old days. Oh, Sally Seton, of course, it was Sally Seton. The last person in the world one would have expected to marry a rich man and live in a large house near Manchester. The wild, the daring, the romantic Sally. But of all that ancient lot, Clarissa's friends, Whitbreads, Kindersleys, Cunninghams, Kinloch Joneses, Sally was probably the best. She tried to get hold of things by the right end anyhow. She saw through Hugh Whitbread anyhow, the admirable Hugh, when Clarissa and the rest were at his feet. The Whitbreads, he could hear her saying. Who are the Whitbreads? Coal merchants? Respectable tradespeople? Hugh she detested for some reason. He thought of nothing but his own appearance, she said. He ought to have been a duke. He would be certain to marry one of the royal princesses. And of course Hugh had the most extraordinary, the most natural, the most sublime respect for the British aristocracy of any human being he had ever come across. Even Clarissa had to own that. Oh, but he was such a dear, so unselfish. Gave up shooting to please his old mother. Remembered his aunt's birthdays and so on. Sally, to do her justice, saw through all that. One of the things he remembered best was an argument one Sunday morning at Burton about women's rights, that antediluvian topic, when Sally suddenly lost her temper, flared up and told Hugh that he represented all that was most detestable in British middle-class life. She told him that she considered him responsible for the state of those poor girls in Piccadilly. Hugh, the perfect gentleman. Poor Hugh. Never did a man look more horrified. Now, what that is referring to there, the poor girls in Piccadilly, refers to the prostitutes of Piccadilly Circus. So, Hugh's character as upper class, it's like here Woolf is making a point about where responsibility lies in the social system. So Hugh is inauthentic, representative of the upper classes, and he has an indifference to structural inequality. And so that notion that if not for the social systems in England and the big divide between the upper and lower classes, then perhaps prostitution would not have been necessary for women who had no other option. She did it on purpose, she said afterwards, for they used to get together in the vegetable garden and compare notes. He's read nothing, thought nothing, felt nothing. He could hear her saying in that very emphatic voice, which carried so much farther than she knew. The stable boys had more life in them than Hugh, she said. He was a perfect specimen of the public school type, she said. And just a note, you don't have to write this down, but just so that you know, in England, public schools are the exclusive, historically significant private schools. So the opposite to what we have in Australia. No country but England could have produced him. She was really spiteful for some reason, had some grudge against him. Something had happened, he forgot what, in the smoking room. He'd insulted her, kissed her? Incredible. Nobody believed a word against Hugh, of course. Who could? Kissing Sally in the smoking room. If it had been some Honourable Edith or Lady Violet, perhaps, but not that ragamuffin Sally without a penny to her name, and a father or a mother gambling at Monte Carlo. For of all the people he had ever met, Hugh was the greatest snob, the most obsequious. No, he didn't cringe exactly. He was too much of a prig for that. A first-rate valet was the obvious comparison. Somebody who walked behind carrying suitcases could be trusted to send telegrams indispensable to hostesses. And he'd found his job, married his Honourable Evelyn, got some little post at court, looked after the king's cellars, polished the imperial shoe buckles, went about in knee breeches and lace ruffles. How remorseless life is. Little job at court. He had married this lady, the Honourable Evelyn, and they lived hereabouts, so he thought, looking at the pompous houses overlooking the park. For he had lunched there once in a house which had, like all Hugh's possessions, something that no other house could possibly have. Linen cupboards, it might have been. You had to go and look at them. You had to spend a great deal of time always admiring whatever it was, linen cupboards, pillowcases, old furniture, pictures, which Hugh had picked up for an old song. But Mrs. Hugh sometimes gave the show away. She was one of those obscure, mouse-like little women who admire big men. She was almost negligible, and suddenly she would say something quite unexpected, something sharp. She had the relics of the grand manner, perhaps. The steam coal was a little too strong for her, made the atmosphere thick. And so there they lived with their linen cupboards and their old masters and their pillowcases fringed with real lace, at the rate of 5,000 or 10,000 a year, presumably, while he, who was 2 years older than Hugh, caged for a job. At 53 he had to come and ask them to put him into some secretary's office, to find him some usher's job teaching little boys Latin, at the beck and call of some mandarin in an office, something that brought in 500 a year. For if he married Daisy, even with his pension, they could never do on less. Whitbread could do it, presumably, or Dalloway. He didn't mind what he asked Dalloway. He was a thorough good sort, a bit limited, a bit thick in the head, yes, but a thorough good sort. Whatever he took up, he did in the same matter-of-fact, sensible way, without a touch of imagination, without a spark of brilliancy, but with the inexplicable niceness of his type. He ought to have been a country gentleman. He was wasted on politics. He was at his best out of doors with horses and dogs. How good he was, for instance, when that great shaggy dog of Clarissa's got caught in a trap and had its paw half torn off, and Clarissa turned faint, and Dalloway did the whole thing, bandaged, made splints, told Clarissa not to be a fool. That was what she liked him for, perhaps. That was what she needed. Now, my dear, don't be a fool. Hold this, fetch that. All the time talking to the dog as if it were a human being. But how could she swallow all that stuff about poetry? How could she let him hold forth about Shakespeare? Seriously and solemnly, Richard Dalloway got on his hind legs and said that no decent man ought to read Shakespeare's sonnets because it was like listening at keyholes. Besides, the relationship was not one that he approved. No decent man ought to let his wife visit a deceased wife's sister. Incredible. The only thing to do was to pelt him with sugared almonds. It was at dinner, but Clarissa sucked it all in, though thought it so honest of him, so independent of him. Heaven knows if she didn't think him the most original mind she'd ever met. That was one of the bonds between Sally and himself. There was a garden where they used to walk, a walled-in place, with rose bushes and giant cauliflowers. He could remember Sally tearing off a rose, stopping to exclaim at the beauty of the cabbage leaves in the moonlight. It was extraordinary how vividly it all came back to him, things he hadn't thought of for years. Or she implored him, half laughing of course, to carry off Clarissa, to save her from the Hughes and the Dalloways and all the other perfect gentlemen who would stifle her soul. She wrote reams of poetry in those days, make a mere hostess of her, encourage her worldliness. But one must do Clarissa justice. She wasn't going to marry Hugh anyhow. She had a perfectly clear notion of what she wanted. Her emotions were all on the surface. Beneath she was very shrewd, far better judge of character than Sally, for instance, and with it all, perfectly feminine, with that extraordinary gift, that woman's gift, of making a world of her own wherever she happened to be. She came into a room. She stood, as he had often seen her, in a doorway with lots of people round her, but it was Clarissa one remembered. Not that she was striking, not beautiful at all. There was nothing picturesque about her. She never said anything especially clever. There she was, however. There she was. No. He was not in love with her any more. He only felt, after seeing her that morning among her scissors and silks, making ready for the party, unable to get away from the thought of her. She kept coming back and back like a sleeper jolting against him in a railway carriage, which was not being in love, of course. It was thinking of her, criticising her, starting again after 30 years, trying to explain her. The obvious thing to say of her was that she was worldly, cared too much for rank and society and getting on in the world, which was true in a sense. She had admitted it to him. You could always get her to own up if you took the trouble. She was honest. What she would say was that she hated frumps, fogies, failures, like himself, presumably. Thought people had no right to slouch about with their hands in their pockets, must do something, be something. And these great swells, these duchesses, these hoary old countesses one met in her drawing room, unspeakably remote as he felt them to be from anything that mattered a straw, stood for something real to her. All right, the underlined bits, I've got this as the nature of time and memory colour. And so here we see the intrusive and irrepressible nature of memory. Because what's going on is that Peter is trying to deny his love for Clarissa, but instead reveals just how in love he remains and how willingly his memory betrays him. And what is meant there is that he's trying to convince himself, no, I love Daisy, I don't love Clarissa, but his memory, he can't hold back the memories of Clarissa that remind him of everything that he loves about her. He can't escape them. Lady Bexborough, she once said, held herself upright. So did Clarissa herself. She never lounged in any sense of the word. She was straight as a dart, a little rigid in fact. She said they had a kind of courage which the older she grew, the more she respected. In all this there was a great deal of Dalloway, of course, a great deal of the public-spirited, British Empire, tariff reform, governing class spirit, which had grown on her as it tends to do. With twice his wits, she had to see things through his eyes, one of the tragedies of married life. With a mind of her own, she must always be quoting Richard, as if one couldn't know to a tittle what Richard thought by reading the Morning Post of a morning. All right, so this here, the annotation is that we've got a reflection on paternalistic and patriarchal conventions of marriage, because it's saying that, you know, what a shame it is that Clarissa is twice as smart as Richard, but in marriage she has to just agree with everything that he says. And when he says, as if you couldn't know what he's thinking just by reading the Morning Post. So the Morning Post was a newspaper for the upper classes, and so it was narrow in its information. It just kind of pandered to what they wanted to know and think, and so Peter sees him as being quite narrow in his understanding of the world. These parties, for example, were all for him, or for her idea of him. To do Richard justice, he would have been happier farming in Norfolk. She made her drawing room a sort of meeting place. She had a genius for it. Over and over again he had seen her take some raw youth, twist him, turn him, wake him up, set him going. Infinite numbers of dull people conglomerated around her, of course. But odd, unexpected people turned up. An artist sometimes a writer. Queer fish in that atmosphere. And behind it all was that network of visiting, leaving cards, being kind to people, running about with bunches of flowers, little presents. So-and-so was going to France, must have an air cushion. A real drain on her strength, or that indeterminable traffic that women of her sort keep up, but she did it genuinely, from a natural instinct. Oddly enough, she was one of the most thoroughgoing skeptics he had ever met, and possibly this was a theory he used to make up to account for her, so transparent in some way, so inscrutable in others. Possibly, she said to herself, as we are a doomed race, chained to a sinking ship. Her favourite reading as a girl was Huxley and Tyndall, and they were fond of these nautical metaphors. As the whole thing is a bad joke, let us at any rate do our part. Mitigate the sufferings of our fellow prisoners, Huxley again. Decorate the dungeon with flowers and air cushions. Be as decent as we possibly can. Those ruffians, the gods, shan't have it all their own way. Her notion being that the gods, who never lost a chance of hurting, thwarting and spoiling human lives, were seriously put out if, all the same, you behaved like a lady. Alright, so we've got here, and this is the search for meaning and fulfillment. Big modernist concern was the moving away from religion and the notion of atheism that was prevalent. And, you know, if we don't have God, then what's the point of it all? Where do we find our meaning? So Clarissa, as an atheist, looks for meaning in how we treat each other. So because religion was used for such a long time to control people of the lower classes and the poorer classes by saying, you know, if you suffer in this life by doing as God has sent you here to do, then you'll reap the rewards in heaven. So don't complain about your lot. Just keep on being miserable because you'll be happy when you're dead. So if that notion is gone, then she's kind of saying here, well, rather than waiting for death to be happy in heaven, if there is no heaven, we should create a sense of happiness in life. So goodness as authentic rather than for God. So here she's saying, I want to be good and I want to do things for people and make people happy, not because I think it'll get me to heaven, but because it's decent and that's who I want to be. So it's quite a positive way to look at this move away from religion. Okay. That phase came directly after Sylvia's death, that horrible affair. To see your own sister killed by a falling tree, all Justin Parry's fault, all his carelessness, before your very eyes. Girl too on the verge of life, the most gifted of them, Clarissa always said, was enough to turn one bitter. Later, she wasn't so positive, perhaps. She thought there were no gods, no one was to blame, so she evolved this atheist religion of doing good for the sake of goodness. And of course she enjoyed life immensely. It was her nature to enjoy, though goodness only knows she had her reserves. It was a mere sketch, he often felt, that even he, after all these years, could make of Clarissa. Anyhow, there was no bitterness in her, none of that sense of moral virtue which is so repulsive in good women. She enjoyed practically everything. If you walked with her in Hyde Park now, it was a bed of tulips, now a child in a perambulator, now some absurd little drama she made up on the spur of the moment. Very likely she would have talked to those lovers if she had thought them unhappy. She had a sense of comedy that was really exquisite, but she needed people, always people, to bring it out, with the inevitable result that she frittered her time away, lunching, dining, giving these incessant parties of hers, talking nonsense, saying things she didn't mean, blunting the edge of her mind, losing her discrimination. There she would sit at the head of the table, taking infinite pains with some old buffer who might be useful to Dalloway. They knew the most appalling bores in Europe. Or in came Elizabeth, and everything must give way to her. She was at a high school, at the inarticulate stage last time he was over, a round-eyed, pale-faced girl with nothing of a mother in her, a silent, stolid creature who took it all as a matter of course, let her mother make a fuss of her, and then said, "May I go now?" Like a child of 4 going off Clarissa explained, with that mixture of amusement and pride which Dalloway himself seemed to rouse in her, to play hockey. Now Elizabeth was out, presumably, thought him an old fogey, laughed at her mother's friends. Oh well, so be it. The compensation of growing old, Peter Walsh thought, coming out of Regent's Park and holding his hat in hand, was simply this, that the passions remain as strong as ever, but one has gained at last the power which adds a supreme flavour to existence, the power of taking hold of experience, of turning it round slowly in the light. So we can see him here having a more positive consideration of being older, and that he sees that he's got this experience which is of benefit as he's older. But, you know, before Clarissa was lamenting growing older, and I think she always recognises the unfairness in her view of the situation for men and women, within this context, how age seems to treat the genders differently. A terrible confession it was. He put his hat on again. But now, at the age of 53, one scarcely needed people anymore. Life itself, every moment of it, every drop of it, here, this instant, now in the sun, in Regent's Park, was enough. Too much, indeed. A whole lifetime was too short to bring out, now that one had acquired the power, the full flavour to extract every ounce of pleasure, every shade of meaning, which both were so much more solid than they used to be, so much less personal. It was impossible that he should ever suffer again, as Clarissa had made him suffer. For hours at a time, pray God that one might say these things without being overheard. For hours and days he never thought of Daisy. So here we can see that he still is very much in love with Clarissa, or that at least the love that he and Clarissa had, even though they never did anything about it, was far more, I guess, passionate than what he feels now for Daisy, because he says that he'll go for hours and days and not think of Daisy, but he's continually thinking about Clarissa. Could it be that he was in love with her then, remembering the misery, the torture, the extraordinary passion of those days? It was a different thing altogether, a much pleasanter thing, the truth being, of course, that now she was in love with him. Okay, so we've got here paradox, the conflicting emotions of love. And here he's talking about the fact that it's much pleasanter for him now with Daisy because Daisy's in love with him. And so none of that intensity of feeling or pressure is on him because he's the one who's desired. And that perhaps was the reason why, when the ship actually sailed, he felt an extraordinary relief. Wanted nothing so much as to be alone. Was annoyed to find all her little attentions, cigars, notes, a rug for the voyage in his cabin. Everyone, if they were honest, would say the same. One doesn't want people after 50. One doesn't want to go on telling women they are pretty. That's what most men of 50 would say, Peter Walsh thought, if they were honest. But then these astonishing accesses of emotion, bursting into tears this morning, what was that all about? What could Clarissa have thought of him? Thought him a fool, presumably. Not for the first time. It was jealousy that was at the bottom of it. Jealousy which survives every other passion of mankind, Peter Walsh thought, holding his pocket knife at arm's length. She had been meeting Major Ord, Daisy said in her last letter. Said it on purpose, he knew. Said it to make him jealous. He could see her wrinkling her forehead as she wrote, wondering what she could say to hurt him. And yet it made no difference. He was furious. All this pother of coming to England and seeing lawyers wasn't to marry her, but to prevent her from marrying anybody else. That was what tortured him. That was what came over him when he saw Clarissa so calm, so cold, so intent on her dress or whatever it was, realising what she might have spared him, what she had reduced him to, a whimpering, snivelling old ass. But women, he thought, shutting his pocket knife, don't know what passion is. They don't know the meaning of it to men. Clarissa was as cold as an icicle. There she would sit on the sofa by his side, let him take her hand, give him one kiss on the cheek. Here he was at the crossing. A sound interrupted him, a frail, quivering sound, a voice bubbling up without direction, vigour, beginning or end, running weakly and shrilly, and with an absence of all human meaning into fa so sweet tu tu. Now, here we've got the interlude of the battered woman. Now, it's kind of like the solitary traveller that Peter had in his dream, but here it's this singing of this woman on the street. Now, the battered woman is an androgynous figure, a creature from ancient times who has given herself to and been absorbed by the land. So we've got this, I guess, this mythical figure that is, from ancient times, but there's also this actual woman here in the street singing in a nonsensical way. The voice of no age or sex, the voice of an ancient spring spouting from the earth, which issued just opposite Regent's Park tube station, from a tall quivering shape like a funnel, like a rusty pump, like a wind-beaten tree forever barren of leaves, which lets the wind run up and down its branches, singing, Iam fa so, ho sweet hu u, and rocks and creaks and moans in the eternal breeze. Through all ages, when the pavement was grass, when it was swamp, through the age of Tuscan mammoth, through the age of silent sunrise, the battered woman, for she wore a skirt, with her right hand exposed, her left clutching at her side, stood singing of love. Love which has lasted 1,000,000 years, she sang. Love which prevails, and millions of years ago her lover who had been dead these centuries had walked, she crooned, with her in May. But in the course of ages, long as summer days and flaming, she remembered, with nothing but red asters, he had gone. Death's enormous sickle had swept those tremendous hills, and when at last she laid her hoary and immensely aged head on the earth, now became a mere cinder of ice, she implored the gods to lay by her side a bunch of purple heather. There on her high burial place, which the last rays of the last sun caressed, then the pageant of the universe would be over. As the ancient song bubbled up opposite Regent's Park tube station, still the earth seemed green and flowery, still, though it issued from so rude a mouth, a mere hole in the earth, muddy too, matted with root fibres and tangled grasses, still the old bubbling, burbling song, soaking through the knotted roots of infinite ages, and skeletons and treasure streamed away in rivulets over the pavement and all along the Marybone Road, and down towards Euston, fertilizing, leaving a damp stain. Still remembering how once in some primeval May she had walked with her lover, this rusty pump, this battered old woman, with one hand exposed for coppers, the other clutching her side, would still be there in 10,000,000 years, remembering how once she had walked in May, where the sea flows now, with whom it did not matter. He was a man, oh yes, a man who had loved her, but the passage of ages had blurred the clarity of that ancient May day. The bright petalled flowers were hoar and silver frosted, and she no longer saw, when she implored him, as she did now quite clearly, look in my eyes with thy sweet eyes intently. She no longer saw brown eyes, black whiskers or sunburnt face, but only a looming shape, a shadow shape, to which, with the bird-like freshness of the very age, she still twittered, "Give me your hand and let me press it gently." Peter Walsh couldn't help giving the poor creature a coin as he stepped into his taxi. "And if someone should see, what matter they?" she demanded, and her fist clutched at her side, and she smiled, pocketing her shilling, and all peering inquisitive eyes seemed blotted out. In the passing generations, the pavement was crowded with bustling middle-class people, vanished like leaves to be trodden under, to be soaked and steeped and made mould of by that eternal spring. Iam fa so, hu sweet hu emu. Alright, and our annotation for this, quickly before our hour runs out. intertextual echo of T.S. Eliot's poetry. The old woman singing echoes the fragmented, chaotic and urban landscapes found in Eliot's poetry, especially the wasteland. The fragmented sounds portray the alienation, psychological distress and the breakdown of traditional meaning in post-World War I London. Alright, stay tuned for part 2 of this section.